All right, Revelation backgrounds. We're now in chapter 6, and I'm calling this chapter the birth pains. We're going to see the first 6 scrolls are broken, and then the ensuing plagues are released. And what's interesting is that this follows Jesus' discourse in Matthew 24 very, very closely. So it's really fun to see how interconnected the Bible is, and so we'll get into this as we go through this lesson. All right, let's go ahead and read chapter 6. Next, I watched as the Lamb broke the first of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living beings say in a thundering voice, "Go." I looked, and there in front of me was a white horse. Its rider had a bow and was given a crown, and he rode off as a conqueror to conquer. When he broke the 2nd seal, I heard the 2nd living being say, "Go." Another horse went out, a red one, and its rider was given the power to take peace away from the earth and make people slaughter one another. He was given a great sword. When he broke the 3rd seal, I heard the 3rd living being say, "Go." I looked, and there in front of me was a black horse, and its rider held in his hand a pair of scales. I heard what sounded like a voice from among the 4 living beings say, "2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages, 6 pounds of barley for the same price, but don't damage the oil or the wine." When he broke the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living being say, "Go." I looked, and there in front of me was a pallid, sickly-looking horse. Its rider's name was Death, and Sheol followed behind him. They were given authority to kill 1/4 of the world by war, by famine, by plagues, and with all the wild animals of the earth. When the Lamb broke the 5th seal, I saw underneath the altar the souls of those who had been put to death for proclaiming the word of God, that is, for bearing witness. They cried in a loud voice, "Sovereign ruler, Hakodesh, the Holy One, the True One, how long will it be before you judge the people living on earth and avenge our blood?" Each of them was given a white robe, and they were told to wait a little longer until the full number of their fellow servants should be reached, of their brothers who would be killed just as they had been. Then I watched as he broke the 6th seal, and there was a great earthquake. The sun turned black as sackcloth worn in mourning, and the full moon became blood red. The stars fell from heaven to earth just as a fig tree drops its figs when shaken by a strong wind. The sky receded like a scroll being rolled up, and every mountain and island was moved from its place. Then the earth's kings, the rulers, the generals, the rich and the mighty, indeed everyone, slave and free, hid himself in caves among the rocks in the mountains, and said to the mountains and rocks, "Fall on us, and hide us from the face of the one sitting on the throne, and from the fury of the Lamb, for the great day of their fury has come, and who can stand?" All right, so we're heading into the famous 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and really the beginning of the woes start in chapter 6 that will unfold throughout the rest of the book. It's interesting in Jewish apocalyptic literature. There's several sources where it's just clear that there's an expectation that before Messiah comes, there will be this period of tribulation and judgment leading up to the final redemption of God's people. So all this is very consistent. I mentioned the reference to Matthew. Revelation also has echoes of Exodus. And we're going to see that the plagues of Egypt are all basically recreated again in Revelation. And so we'll touch on those as we go through. And then at the end, I'll have a summary table where we'll tie it all together. So again, the concept of God's people cry out, God hears, God brings judgment upon the captors. And in the case of Exodus, it was Egypt. And in the case of Revelation, it's the world. And then God will deliver his people, after those plagues have concluded. So we'll dig into that as we go through this. So horseman imagery appears twice in Zechariah. And so we'll look at that next. Zechariah 1 also has an image of 4 horsemen. I saw in the night, and behold, a man riding on a red horse. He was standing among the myrtle trees in the glen, and behind him were 3 more horses, red, sorrel, and white horses. Then I said, "What are these, my lord?" The angel who talked with me said, "I will show you what they are." So the man who was standing among the myrtle trees answered, "These are they whom the Lord has sent to patrol the earth." And they answered the angel of the Lord who was standing among the myrtle trees and said, "We have patrolled the earth, and behold, all the earth remains at rest." So the thought is the horses are part of God's council. We might call it the divine council. And this unseen realm that we've talked about references these as also. So we have these horses that are just there to go and view and then report back to God in Zechariah, and then in Revelation, the horses have a little bit different job description. Similar thought in Zechariah 6, although here we have 4 chariots. Again, I lifted my eyes and saw, and behold, 4 chariots came out from between 2 mountains. And the mountains were mountains of bronze. The first chariot had red horses, the second black, the third white, and the fourth chariot dappled horses. So now we're seeing the same colors that we see in Revelation. All of them strong. Then I answered and said to the angel who talked with me, "What are these, my Lord?" And the angel answered and said to me, "These are going out to the 4 winds of heaven." And just a note, we're going to see the 4 winds of heaven next time in Revelation 7, verse 1. So there's tuck that verse away, the 4 winds of heaven. After presenting themselves before the Lord of all the earth, the chariot with the black horses goes towards the north country. The white ones go out after them, and the dappled ones go out towards the south country. When the strong horses came out, they were impatient to go and patrol the earth. And he said, "Go patrol the earth." So they patrolled the earth. So again, both passages describe members of this divine council on horseback that are basically sent to go take a look at what's going on and report back. And we see that imagery several times in the Old Testament. And so again, we have these, the first 5 seals are in Matthew 24. We have a conqueror and perhaps false messiahs that lead people astray. We'll take a look at what that might mean in Revelation 6. Then we talk about war, famine, in terms of inflation, famine, pestilence, and sword. And then the 5th horse is martyrdom. And the key thing is that these are basically referenced in Matthew 24, but the key verse is that these are non-signs. The end is not yet. And he says, "See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet." So in one sense, all 4 horsemen plus the 5th seal of martyrdom that we're going to get to, they have been at work throughout human history, and probably no more so than the 20th century, which was the bloodiest century on record. Lots of wars, lots of famine, increasing intensity of these things. So again, these are, the end is not yet. So these are just precursors, or as the Bible likes to describe them, birth pains. So the image is of a woman in labor where the contractions are getting closer and closer, but even though they're getting closer, it's not time for the baby yet. So it's painful, but we're just going to have to wait a little while longer. And the key thing to remember is that Revelation and the whole Bible is not a book of fear. It's for hope. And so we need to remember Luke 21:28. "Now when these things begin to take place, straighten up and raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near." So it's alarming, but we shouldn't be alarmed. We should be excited, because just as a woman whose contractions are getting closer and closer together, it means it's almost time for the baby. All right, the first seal. "Next I watched as the Lamb broke the first of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living beings say in a thundering voice, 'Go.'" So just a reminder that the seals are not part of the document itself. They're just the outer seals that are being broken. So the document can't actually be opened and read until after all the seals are broken, and we won't see the 7th seal broken until Revelation chapter 8. So just as there was a period of 10 plagues that were poured out on Egypt before God's people could be delivered, it may be the same thing going on here. So we have to have judgment and deliverance from those oppressors happen first, and then comes the salvation and deliverance of the people. So remember, Jesus here is opening the scrolls in front of the elders, the 4 living creatures, and the millions and millions, perhaps the heavenly witnesses mentioned in Deuteronomy and Psalm. So Deuteronomy 30, "I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore choose life, that you and your offspring may live." And then the same thought in Psalm 50, "He calls the heavens above and to the earth, that he may judge his people." So there's lots of witnesses to testify about how deserving the wicked earth was of these judgments. So this is not an unjust God. God is fully just and fully fair. Missler pointed out, and Lancaster also picked up on this as well, that when the elders speak, the subject is heaven. But when the four living creatures speak, the subject has to deal with earth. And so we just kind of see that little dichotomy. And we saw this in Ezekiel as well, and Isaiah. So Isaiah was having he was from an elevated position looking at the heavenly aspect of it, whereas Ezekiel was seeing the lower aspects that were dealing with earth. So just lots of deep things going on here, but just kind of keep that in mind that there's a lot going on here, much more than we can unpack in a quick video. So Lancaster adds that we have go there. It could easily be translated as come, meaning it's saying come down from the heavenly realm and go down to earth. So come forth and then go. So come or go, either is a perfectly fine translation. First horse. I looked, and there in front of me was a white horse. Its rider had a bow and was given a crown, and he rode off as a conqueror to conquer. So one thing I found interesting was that the original audience would definitely have seen some anti-Roman imagery here. The biggest threat to the Roman Empire, and we don't study them a lot in our high school history class, but they were the Parthians, and the Parthians were basically the arch enemy to the east. So they were in Iraq, Iran, in those lands today, and they were really kind of feared by the Romans. The reason for the fear was that they were hyper skilled in archery. I mean, they were just excellent archers. And they, according to Keener, they typically rode white horses. So kind of this unmistakable parallel would have been clear to the first century audience there. You may have heard the phrase the Parthian shot, and it sometimes gets called the parting shot. And this is a nod to the Parthians' skill at archery. They could bring down a bird in flight, right or left-handed, while facing forward or backward at a full gallop. And because stirrups had not yet been invented, you can see on this picture here, it was all leg and all core strength. So just this tremendous skill that these archers had. And oftentimes they would shoot at their enemies while faking a retreat. And it became known as the Parthian shot. So this kind of, somewhere along the line, this got misinterpreted or misunderstood as a parting shot, but it also fits too. So they're pretending to leave, but they're going to get one last blast on their way out. And just kind of as a reminder, when we look in Matthew 2, we read that Herod and all Jerusalem was in an uproar when the Magi showed up. And so you have to think, would 3 guys on camels have caused the whole city to be in an uproar? Probably not. I mean, they were thinking the Magi were from the east. This could have been the beginnings of a Parthian invasion kind of thing. So that's why they were all kind of all in an uproar there. What's interesting is in Hebrew, the word for bow is keshet, and it could be a bow, like as a bow and arrow weapon, but also the bow that was the sign of the covenant with Noah is the same word. So just keep in mind that the conquest could be by a feat of arms, or it could be by a seemingly peaceful treaty using deceptive means. Like, a land for peace kind of deal that Hitler did with Neville Chamberlain, who infamously, said there's peace in our time. He was totally deceived, and Hitler had other intentions. He was just using this as a pretext for a deeper invasion. So don't discount the bow could be a weapon, or it could be a treaty of some kind. So the commentators scratch their heads trying to figure out who this rider is. Some commentators actually see Jesus as the man with a crown on a white horse, but as Chuck Missler says, this rider here keeps bad company, right? The other 3 horses are bringing, death and destruction. So, how could this be Jesus? And another comment is that Jesus is the one opening the seals. He's not inside them being launched. So things to think about there. Other comments have said, well, it's not Jesus, but it's the gospel message going out. And so again, this is also unlikely given the other 3 riders. So the next 3 horses are bringing death and destruction, and the first rider is passing out tracts or something like that. I don't see that. This could also be the false Messiah riding on a white horse. Okay, now we're getting better here. He's got a crown, and what's interesting is the crown is not the diadem that the Messiah will wear, but it is the Stephanos. It's the laurel, the runner, the victor's wreath kind of thing. So that's the crown he's given here. So he's a victor and bent on conquering. Some have also suggested that the writer doesn't conquer by war because he doesn't have to, right? He deceives the people by pretending to come in peace, and that's kind of what the Antichrist will do, and we'll see later. He carries a bow, just like Nimrod did in Genesis 10, and really Nimrod was the first human global dictator, the first global deceiver, so there could be a nod there. Again, we have to remember that Jesus is the one opening the seals. And, would it be logical to have Jesus sending the Antichrist on earth? And so kind of wandering into a theological thin ice with that one. But it's just interesting to see that these, he has some parallels to the Antichrist. It might be best to consider this writer and the other three writers as similar to the death angel or the destroyer that we read about in Exodus 12. For the Lord will pass through and strike the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the doorpost, the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer or the death angel to enter your houses and to strike you. So, and otherwise, it's an unidentified supernatural being sent out by God to carry out God's judgment in the form of conquering and deception. So while this may not be the Antichrist, because I don't see Jesus sending out the Antichrist, Jesus does say in Matthew 24, "For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, I am the Messiah, and they will lead many astray." And what you see on the screen are coins from what's called the Bar Kokhba revolt. And this was the second Jewish war that was in the early to mid second century. And it was this false Messiah who tried to lead a revolt against Rome, and it just didn't end well. So maybe not the Antichrist, but just all of the false messiahs who have appeared on the scene throughout history. But in any case, the readers would have understood that the horsemen represent a conquest, perhaps in all of its forms. And so one application could be, the next horses are going to bring sword, famine, pestilence. So those could be external threats in a sense. But the false white horse could possibly represent the enemy within, right? The enemy we welcome into our assembly with open arms, but who is only there to conquer and lead people astray. And we talked about the lesson of Hitler and Neville Chamberlain, right? Neville Chamberlain thought he had a deal with Hitler, and you just can't make a deal with someone like that. They're just going to they're bent on conquering, and they have to be put down in other ways. So we saw this with a couple of the 7 churches as well. They had compromised, and so that's you can't compromise with evil because they are still evil, but you're the one that ends up being tainted. Lancaster just sees this as the spirit of conquest that has always existed throughout humanity, perhaps taking on a very specific form in the final days. So there is an argument that the first 5 scrolls have already been opened, and they were opened a long time ago, because we see all these things, famine, earthquakes, wars, deceivers, the martyrs is the 5th seal. We see these throughout history. So, perhaps they're just increasing in intensity like we saw in the 20th century. Perhaps they're all still yet future in a way that is, chilling to think about. But the alternative is that the first 5 may have already been opened, and we're now in the period between the 5th and 6th seals. When he broke the 2nd seal, I heard the 2nd living being say, "Go." Another horse went out, a red one, and its rider was given the power to take peace away from the earth and to make people slaughter each other. He was given a great sword. So red has long been the color associated with war. So we have Mars was the Roman god of war, and so hence Mars is the red planet. It was kind of clear when they looked up in the sky and they saw a red planet that they named that one Mars. We'll see in Revelation 12 a red dragon, and in Revelation 17 a scarlet or red beast that was full of blasphemous names. So red is not a good color in this case. In Matthew 24, Jesus talks about many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. So we have, again, this tie-in of make people slaughter each other. So Lancaster writes, this is the spirit of war, which includes civil war, brother against brother, and it just unleashes the worst in man. And we saw that primarily, a lot during the 20th century. Stern, in his commentary, sees the first 2 seals as both representing war, but perhaps in 2 different aspects. So the first seal is subjecting peoples to a foreign ruler, not necessarily as a result of an armed conflict. So we talked about the peace in our time and the peace treaty that Neville Chamberlain, who was the Prime Minister of England, signed with Hitler, basically giving Hitler Czechoslovakia, and he didn't need an army to overrun Czechoslovakia. He just kind of waltzed in and took over. Whereas the second seal would be hate between nations, leading to a clash of arms. So an army moves in to conquer by war. So in the same way, the third and fourth seals we're going to get to could be viewed as two separate aspects of famine, and so we'll look at that next. When he broke the third seal, I heard the third living being say, "Go." I looked, and there in front of me was a black horse, and its rider held in his hand a pair of scales. Then I heard what sounded like a voice from among the four living beings say, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages, 6 pounds of barley for the same price. Don't damage the oil or the wine. So the scales here suggest food shortages, perhaps as a result of the famine that we're going to see in the next seal, but in this case it's a monetary. It leads to rationing, and then rationing leads to inflation. So every ounce of product sold had to be carefully measured. Keener suggests the price of wheat here is 10 times what it should be. So a family of limited means would have to buy the cheaper and far less nourishing barley, which is a bargain because it's only 5 times the usual price. So we kind of see that underlying happening here. A day's wage we've talked about in our gospel studies was a denarius. And again, we see this unit of measure frequently. We do see this to talk about famine and things like that in Leviticus 26. When I break your supply of bread, 10 women shall bake your bread in a single oven, and shall dole out your bread again by weight, and you shall eat and not be satisfied. Ezekiel 4, and your food that you eat shall be by weight, 20 shekels a day. From day to day you shall eat it. And again, we have this tie-in to the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. Okay, so what is this about the oil and the wine? Well, barley and wheat were basic necessities, whereas oil and wine were luxuries. Now, Lancaster had an interesting opinion on this one here. He says, in the Messianic era, there is promised to be an abundance of wine and oil. So to him, the fact that the oil and wine are not touched, that suggests a short duration of famine, because apparently olive trees, if you chop down an olive tree, you've got to plant a new one, and it takes years to regrow, to get crops again, and something similar, I guess, with grapes. So basically these crops, if they were touched, would take years to replace, and possibly jeopardizing availability of wine and oil in the Messianic kingdom. So just an interesting comment, I thought, there on why the wine and oil are not touched. Ultimately, we don't know. And so something else that would have been on the minds of the first century readers is that during the first Jewish war, so that's 66 to 72, the famine actually killed more Jews than the Romans did. And at one point, Josephus records the Romans bursting into the city and surprised to find that most had already died of starvation. So this would have been around 20, 25 years before Revelation was written. So very much still on the minds of the recipients. So when they heard famine, they would have thought of the destruction of Jerusalem and just the traumatic event that entailed there. Much like today, if those of us who are of a certain age, we think plane crashing into a building, what do we think of, right? We think of 9/11. And so even though that was over 20 years ago, it's still a very fresh memory. And so mentioning famine to the first century churches in Asia would have had that similar kind of traumatic jarring, and they would have recalled the destruction of Jerusalem. When he broke the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living being say, "Go." I looked, and there in front of me was a pallid, sickly-looking horse. Its rider's name was Death, and Sheol followed behind him. They were given authority to kill 1/4 of the world by war, by famine, by plagues, and with the wild animals of the earth. So this is just full out death and destruction. And we see this in Ezekiel 14. For thus says the Lord God, how much more when I send upon Jerusalem my 4 disastrous acts of judgment, sword, famine, wild beasts, and pestilence, to cut it off from man and beast. So the translators have a tough time with this color. In Greek, the word is chloros, and we get the word chlorine and chlorophyll from that. So it's like a pale green, and I just immediately thought of the sickly and nauseated emoji of that, kind of ugly, putrid green color. Kind of very descriptive there. Another verse from Ezekiel: "You shall be a reproach and a taunt, a warning and a horror to the nations around you when I execute judgment on you in anger and fury and with furious rebukes. I, the Lord, have spoken when I send against you the deadly arrows of famine, arrows for destruction, which I will send to destroy you. When I bring more and more famine upon you and break your supply of bread, I will send famine and wild beasts against you, and they will rob you of your children." So again, very much a common theme of God's judgment is famines and plagues and wild beasts. It's interesting that death claims the body, but he says Sheol follow behind him, but Sheol claims the soul. So potentially this is all of the death and destruction that results from the first three seals. And Missler had an interesting comment. He says, don't discount microscopic wild beasts. And he passed away several years before the COVID pandemic. So don't discount something that's made in a petri dish to be in the category of wild beasts. When the Lamb broke the fifth seal, I saw underneath the altar the souls who have been put to death for proclaiming the word of God, that is, for bearing witness. So what is kind of going on here with the altar? A Messianic rabbi of the 1700s stated, "This is in accordance with the Jewish faith that says the souls of the righteous who were killed are like offerings upon the heavenly altar in the heavenly temple." And we see a glimpse of that in Hebrews 9:23. "Thus it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these." So he's Paul, or whoever wrote, the writer to the Hebrews, many believe Paul, is contrasting the heavenly altar with its replica, that is the earthly altar in the earthly temple. "For Christ has entered not into holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God himself." So to the audience receiving this originally, very clear, God has not forgotten about those in Asia who were martyred for his name, and they will be vindicated. So we've studied those in several of the letters to the churches where people had been put to death for proclaiming the word of God. Started under Nero in the 60s. We had the Jewish War in the mid-60s and 70s. And then Domitian would have been in the 80s and 90s. So first century martyrdom they were no stranger to this here. And here martyrs are viewed as sacrifices, just like the Passover lamb was in Revelation 5. And God talks about the life of the flesh is in the blood. "I have given it for you on the altar to make atonement for your souls, for it is the blood that makes atonement for life." So again, whereas on the earthly tabernacle we had animals, in the heavenly tabernacle, could it be the blood of the martyrs that is making the sacrifice? Leviticus 5 also says, "He shall sprinkle some of the blood on the sin offering on the side of the altar, while the rest of the blood shall be drained out of the base of the altar. It is a sin offering." And so it's interesting that John can apparently see souls in his visionary state. And so it's kind of, he says, "I saw the souls." So if the first four seals parallel Matthew 24, 5-8, then note Matthew 24, verse 9, which says, "They will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake." So Jesus clearly predicted that martyrdom people would not escape it. Verse 10, "They cried out in a loud voice, 'Sovereign ruler, HaKodesh, the Holy One, the True One, how long will it be before you judge people living on earth and avenge our blood?'" And so in the Bible, blood guilt is a much larger issue than many of us may realize. It stains the entire community. And so if God is fully just, he has to take action on this. And we see a glimpse of this in Genesis 4. "And the Lord said to Cain, 'What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground.'" So is that just a figure of speech, or is the blood literally crying? In a sense, there's something deeper happening here. Matthew 23, Jesus says something very similar. "So that on you may come all of the righteous bloodshed on earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. And in the arrangement of the Hebrew Bible, Zechariah would be the last recorded martyr, and of course Abel was the first recorded martyr in Genesis. Deuteronomy 32, rejoice with him, O heavens, bow down to him, all gods, for he avenges the blood of his children and takes vengeance on his adversaries. He repays those who hate him and cleanses his people's land. So there's the thought in the Old Testament, the Torah talks about the avenger of blood who has to seek retribution, because it's just a big deal when innocent blood is shed. There has to be a repayment. Psalm 79, why should the nation say, where is their God? Let the avenging of the outpour blood of your servants be known among the nations before our eyes. So basically, these people are crying out. They know what the Bible says. God, you have to avenge. Someone has to avenge our blood. And so how long will it be before this happens? And the people are crying out. They're going to get an unsatisfactory answer in the next verse. So again, how long? We have this pleading. When will you make things right? It's a very common refrain, particularly in the Psalms. There are several examples, but Psalm 13, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? Zechariah, how long, O Lord of hosts, how long will you have no mercy on Jerusalem and the cities of Judah, against which you have been angry these 70 years? So basically, how much is enough? Or could mean duration too. Romans 12 reminds us that these people are crying out for vengeance, but vengeance is the Lord's, and it says that in Romans 12. Never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. And of course, we have direct instructions from Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. So we should never exact revenge on ourselves. And vengeance is always God's option. It is not our option. So how long, they ask, until our blood is avenged? Here's the answer. Each of them was given a white robe, and they were told to wait a little longer until the full number of servants should be reached of their brothers who would be killed just as they had been. So kind of an unsatisfactory answer. Not only is it not happening now, there's actually going to be more martyrs before vengeance is extracted. So again, we have to have the heavenly perspective, not an earthly one. It may appear that the enemy is winning, but that's just a facade. God wins in the end. So what the white robes, they're pure and ceremonially clean. That's one look. Another thought is that these people haven't been resurrected yet, so they're sort of souls without a body, and it's kind of weird to think about. But the white robe is a temporary covering waiting until the resurrection. Revelation 17, I saw the woman drunk with blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. When I saw her, I marveled greatly. Revelation 18, in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints, and all who have been slain on the earth. So in a very real sense, martyrdom just goes with the territory if you're going to follow our Messiah. And none of us want to be martyred, but we have to remember that many of our brethren throughout history, and even happening in certain parts of the world today, are martyred for their faith. And so it's just something we need to be prepared for. And note that if we have the earthly perspective, that's scary. But if we have the heavenly perspective, then it is all going to be made right in the end, and it is all part of God's plan. That sounds like a cop-out, but in this case, we're getting the heavenly perspective, and that's one of the blessings of studying Revelation. So really, unlike the immediate unleashing of judgment of the first four seals, this fifth seal also promises judgment, but the judgment is deferred, and we just have to hope and wait on God for that to be fulfilled. Genesis 15, I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age, and they shall come back here in the fourth generation. For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. So this is God's promise to Abraham, but Abraham is not going to be the one who receives the benefits of the promise. It's going to be several generations later. When God has to wait for the iniquity of the Amorites to be complete. And so something very similar is happening here with the blood of the martyrs. Then I watched as he broke the sixth seal, and there was a great earthquake.
The sun turned black as sackcloth worn in mourning, and the full moon became blood red. The stars fell from heaven to earth just as a fig tree drops its figs when shaken by a strong wind. The sky receded up like a scroll being rolled up, and every mountain and island was moved from its place. So definitely cataclysmic goings on here. Also referenced by Jesus in the Olivet Discourse. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. So on one hand, I'm absolutely loving the connection between Matthew and Revelation, but on another hand, it's the same person writing it, right? So probably shouldn't be all that surprised, but it is kind of that the pinpoint precision is really fun to behold. So again, this clearly has not happened yet. So some scholars would see that the days we're living in today are the time between the fifth seal and the sixth seal. Other scholars would see all 7 seals as being yet future, but it's just throwing it out there for that observation there. As we looked at when we went through the 7 letters to the 7 believing assemblies, the 7 congregations, earthquakes were very prevalent and often quite destructive. So the fact that there's earthquakes, that wouldn't surprise them. They would be very used to that. But it's the darkness and all of that is very otherworldly. Earthquakes we're used to. Some turning black we're not used to. And again, all of this recalls the 10 plagues, and I'll look at that when we get at the end. But just for this plague, stretch out your hand toward heaven, that there may be a darkness over the land of Egypt, a darkness to be felt. And so that is, there's much more going on here than just the absence of light. This is a darkness that can be felt, and that's a bit chilling for those on the earth that will have to go through that. We also have similar descriptions in Isaiah, Ezekiel, Amos, and Daniel. I'll look at the Isaiah verse. Behold, the day of the Lord comes cruel, with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land a desolation and destroy its sinners from it. So again, all righteous judgment, righteous anger. For the stars of the heavens and their constellation will not give their light. The sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light. So definite darkness is a very clear judgment here. So again, we're noting the parallels between Revelation 6 and Matthew 24, and there's even a fig tree mentioned in both passages. So what a coincidence, huh? Coincidences in quotes. So are we surprised that something mentioned in Jesus's end time discussion with the disciples actually appears in the actual end times discussion? Probably not. Matthew 24, from the fig tree, learn his lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you will know that summer is near, and it goes on. Isaiah also references a fig tree in conjunction with the sky being rolled up. All the host of heaven shall rot away, and skies roll up like a scroll. All their hosts shall fall, and leaves fall from the vine, like leaves falling from the fig tree. So lots of other verses that are quite interesting when you look at it from a science perspective, where the skies are stretched out. And this other verses describe the skies as being like a tent or a canopy. So kind of interesting things going on there from a scientific perspective of what really is the nature of matter, the nature of air and water and all that kind of stuff. Revelation 6, verse 15 through 17. Then the kings, earth's kings, the rulers, the generals, the rich and mighty, indeed everyone, slave and free, hid himself in caves and among the rocks in the mountains, said to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us, hide us from the face of the one sitting on the throne, from the fury of the Lamb, from the great day the great day of the fury has come, and who can stand? And again, another kind of recurring theme are the evil kings, hiding in caves. We see that throughout Scripture. There's a passage in Joshua. The 5 kings fled and hid themselves in the cave at Makkedah, and it was told to Joshua, the 5 kings have been found hidden in the cave at Makkedah. And Joshua said, roll large stones against the mouth of the cave and set men by it to guard them. But do not stay there yourselves. Pursue your enemies, attack their rear guard, and do not let them enter the cities, for the Lord your God has given them into your hand. We also see this Isaiah 2, the people shall enter the caves of the rocks and the holes of the ground. Hosea 10, Basically, they hide. They say to the mountains, "Cover us," and to the hills, "Fall on us." So they're trying to escape God's judgment, and you can guess how well that's going to work out. So verse 16 mentions the fury of the lamb, and that sounds like a contradiction. And it is a contradiction in our natural world, but our lamb is also a lion in the heavenly realm. So it's just interesting. We would think that it would be the fury of the lion, but our God is a lion and lamb, and so he just is described as the fury of the lamb. The great day of their fury has come, and who can stand? And so again, who can stand in the day of the Lord? Joel talks about this. Malachi talks about this. There's several references in talking about who can endure the day of his coming, as Malachi writes. And then in Mark, Jesus writes, "And if the Lord had not cut short those days, no human being would be saved." So who can stand? Well, nobody. But for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he has shortened those days. So it's kind of a question asked and answered here. So on your screen is a table of the 10 plagues in Exodus, and actually this screen shows the first 9 compared to where we see them again in Revelation. And it's just a reminder that God is very consistent, right? The same types of plagues that were poured out on Egypt are now going to be poured out upon the entire earth. There's actually a moment in the Jewish Passover Seder, the celebration, where they're reciting the 10 plagues, and it's actually a moment that is a bit somber. They take 10 drops of wine from the third cup and they spill it. And this reminds them that although the Passover is a joyous occasion overall and reason to celebrate, that it's tempered by the fact that it came at the expense of others. So a lot of people had to suffer and die for them to get their freedom, and that's just how it goes. And that just kind of reminds them of Proverbs 24:17, "When your enemy falls, do not rejoice." And so for Messianic Jews and Gentile believers who have participated in a Passover Seder, then these drops of blood also have added significance as they directly relate to Yeshua, who drank that third cup of the Passover meal and said, "This cup is my blood," and he shed his blood for us. So very highly symbolic and very rich with symbolism. We often think of prophecy as it's a prediction followed by a fulfillment. So somebody says something that hasn't happened yet is going to happen, and then it happens, and then that's prophecy. That's true, but there's also a very real sense where prophecy is pattern. So something that happened before is going to happen again, and the Bible is has a lot of examples of this. And so we saw this with Abraham in Genesis 22 when he starts to sacrifice Isaac. God calls him to sacrifice Isaac, and he's going through all the motions, and he's about ready to, and God holds his hand and says, "Don't do it." What's interesting is Abraham called the name of that place in Genesis 22:14, called the name of that place, "The Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." And so note the future tense there, because on that very same hill in Jerusalem, another father would sacrifice his son. And some have suggested that Abraham knew he was acting out prophecy of the Messiah, and that's why he used what we would call the future tense. And another example is the plagues, the 10 plagues of Exodus, and we kind of see, I'm not going to go through all these, but you can look on the screen or look at the notes. Water to blood occurs in both frogs, lice, flies, pestilence, hail, fire, locust, and darkness. So what about the sacrifice of the firstborn? We do not see that in Revelation, and there's actually a very good reason why we don't see it. All right, so the death of the firstborn, just to refresh everyone's memory, it comes from Exodus 12. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. So this was the 10th and final plague where Pharaoh finally relented and let Moses and let the Israelites go and flee into the wilderness. So why don't we see this recurring in Revelation? Very good reason, and that is Exodus 11:6. there shall be a great cry throughout the land of Egypt. And God is basically promising he's going to have, it will take nothing less than the death of the firstborn for Pharaoh to go. So God wasn't surprised that Pharaoh hardened his heart. He knew it was going to happen. Such as there has never been, and then it promises, nor ever will be again. So God promised that never again will he bring such a devastating event as to kill the firstborn again. That's on a widespread example, but of course, we have our Passover lamb, and that is Revelation 5, verse 6. We saw this. I saw a lamb standing as though it had been slain. And so a very precise choice of words here in Exodus. There never will be again on a grand scale. What God did, though, to remove the curse was send his son, and the son would be the Passover lamb as it has been slain. So kind of ending on a sobering yet hopeful note. We don't see this plague of judgments because the one that took our place has already suffered that judgment. So that is Revelation 6, and next time we will look at Revelation chapter 7. So we'll see you then.